days. Picture this. You're accused of a heinous crime, but there's no evidence. How do you prove your innocence? In medieval times, the answer was simple yet horrifying. You had to endure excruciating pain and suffering to demonstrate your purity before God. Let's transport ourselves back to 12th century England. The year is 1166, and King Henry II has just introduced the Assize of Clarendon, a legal reform that would shape the course of English law for generations. But nestled within this groundbreaking document was a chilling provision: the formalization of trial by ordeal. Imagine standing before a crowd of jeering onlookers, your heart pounding in your chest as you face the prospect of proving your innocence through unimaginable pain. The most common form of ordeal was the dreaded trial by fire. Picture this. A piece of red-hot iron, glowing with malevolent intent, is placed before you. The heat radiates from it, making your skin prickle with fear. You're told to grasp it with your bare hands and carry it for 9 paces, 9 agonizing steps that will determine your fate. As you wrap your trembling fingers around the scorching metal, the searing pain shoots through your body like lightning. Every nerve screams in protest as you force yourself to take that first step. The smell of burning flesh fills the air, and you can hear the sickening sizzle of your own skin. 1 step, 2 steps. Each movement is pure torment. Your vision blurs, your legs threaten to give way, but you press on. 8 steps, 9, and finally, mercifully, it's over. But your ordeal isn't finished yet. Oh no, dear listeners. Now comes the truly terrifying part. Your hand is bound in bandages, and you must wait 3 agonizing days before the wounds are examined. If they've begun to heal cleanly, you're declared innocent. But if infection has set in, God has deemed you guilty, and you face execution or mutilation. Now you might be wondering, surely this can't be real. Surely no sane society would subject people to such cruelty. But I assure you, dear listeners, this was all too real. In fact, the Church actively supported these practices, believing that God would intervene to protect the innocent. Let's turn our attention to another spine-chilling method: the water ordeal. Picture a tranquil lake on a crisp autumn morning. The mist rises off the water, creating an eerily beautiful scene. But for the accused, this serene setting is about to become a nightmare. You're bound hand and foot, a rope tied around your waist. The crowd watches with bated breath as you're lowered into the frigid water. The cold seeps into your bones, stealing your breath away. Now here's the twisted logic. If you sink, you're innocent. If you float, you're guilty. Why? Because the water, seen as pure, would reject a guilty person. Can you imagine the sheer terror of this situation? As the water closes over your head, you're faced with an impossible choice. Do you struggle to survive, potentially proving your guilt? Or do you let yourself sink into the murky depths, hoping against hope that you'll be pulled out in time? One particularly harrowing account comes from the annals of 9th century France. A woman named Theodrata was accused of adultery and subjected to the water ordeal. As she was lowered into the river, witnesses reported that she began to sink, only to suddenly bob back to the surface. The crowd erupted in shouts of, "Witch! Witch!" Theodrata's fate was sealed, and she was dragged from the water to face execution. But wait, there's more. Oh yes, dear listeners, the human capacity for cruelty knows no bounds. Let's explore one of the most gut-wrenching ordeals of all, the trial by ingestion. Imagine being forced to swallow a piece of bread and cheese, known as the korsned, that's been blessed by a priest. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. This wasn't just any old snack. The bread was often mixed with feathers or other irritants, making it nearly impossible to swallow. If you choked or couldn't keep it down, you were deemed guilty. Can you fathom the panic of trying to force down this vile concoction, knowing that your very life depends on it? One particularly gruesome account from 11th century Germany tells of a man accused of theft who literally choked to death during his ordeal. As he gasped for air, clawing at his throat, the crowd watched in horrified fascination. His death was seen as irrefutable proof of his guilt, and his family was left to bear the shame. Now, let's take a moment to consider the psychological toll of these ordeals. Imagine living in a society where at any moment you could be accused of a crime and subjected to these tortures. The constant fear, the paranoia. It's enough to drive anyone mad. And here's a chilling thought. These practices weren't confined to Europe. Oh no, trial by ordeal was a global phenomenon. In parts of Africa, accused persons might be forced to retrieve an object from a pot of boiling oil. In India, there was the rice ordeal, where suspects had to chew dry rice and spit it out. If their mouth was too dry from fear to produce saliva, they were considered guilty. But perhaps one of the most bizarre and terrifying ordeals came from Cambodia. Picture this. 2 identical poles are planted in a sacred river. The accused and the accuser must swim out to the poles and grasp them, then submerge themselves completely. The last one to surface is declared the winner. Can you imagine the sheer terror of holding your breath underwater, knowing that if you surface first, you'll be branded a criminal? Now you might be wondering, how effective were these ordeals? Well, dear listeners, prepare to have your minds blown. According to a study by Peter Leeson, an economist at George Mason University, trial by ordeal may have actually been surprisingly accurate in determining guilt or innocence. How, you ask? It all comes down to the power of belief. You see, most people genuinely believed that God would intervene to protect the innocent. So, if you were truly innocent, you might approach the ordeal with confidence, believing that you'd be protected. This could lead to a calmer state of mind, potentially helping you endure the pain or even affect your body's physiological responses. On the other hand, if you were guilty, the fear and stress might make you more likely to fail the ordeal. It's a fascinating insight into the human psyche and the power of faith. But let's not forget the dark side of this practice. Corrupt officials could easily manipulate the ordeals to achieve their desired outcome. Imagine being lowered into the water, only to discover that the rope around your waist has been secretly loosened, ensuring that you'll float and be declared guilty. One particularly chilling account comes from 13th century England. A man named Aylward of Westoning was accused of theft and subjected to the hot iron ordeal. However, witnesses reported that the iron was suspiciously cool when he grasped it. Aylward passed the test easily, but the accusers, unwilling to accept the result, had him blinded and castrated anyway. It's a stark reminder of the arbitrary and cruel nature of justice in those times. Now let's take a moment to consider the lasting impact of trial by ordeal on our legal system. While we may look back on these practices with horror, they actually played a crucial role in the development of modern jurisprudence. You see, as society began to question the validity of ordeals, alternative methods of determining guilt had to be developed. This led to the rise of trial by jury and the concept of beyond reasonable doubt. In a way, we owe our current legal system to the horrors of the past. But here's a chilling thought. While official trial by ordeal may be a thing of the past in most of the world, vestiges of this mentality still persist. Think about lie detector tests, or the way some people still believe that hardship or suffering can prove one's innocence or devotion. And in some parts of the world, practices eerily reminiscent of trial by ordeal still exist. In rural India, there have been reports of suspected thieves being forced to retrieve coins from pots of boiling oil as recently as 2018. It's a stark reminder that the human desire for simple, definitive answers to complex questions hasn't changed much over the centuries. Now, let's delve into some of the lesser-known ordeals that will make your skin crawl. Have you ever heard of the ordeal of the bier? Picture this. You're accused of murder, and you're forced to approach the corpse of your alleged victim. The belief was that in the presence of the murderer, the corpse would begin to bleed anew. Can you imagine the sheer terror of approaching a dead body, knowing that any natural occurrence, a drop of fluid, a trick of the light, could seal your fate. One particularly haunting account comes from 14th century Germany. A man named Hans was accused of murdering his neighbor. When forced to approach the corpse, witnesses swore they saw blood begin to flow from the victim's nose. Hans was immediately declared guilty and executed on the spot. It wasn't until years later that the true murderer confessed on his deathbed. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the ordeal of the cross. In this twisted test, the accused and the accuser would stand before a cross with their arms outstretched. The first person to lower their arms was declared the loser. Sounds simple, right? But imagine standing there for hours, your muscles screaming in agony, knowing that if you give in to the pain, you'll be branded a criminal. One particularly grueling account from 9th century France describes a trial that lasted for nearly 9 hours. Both participants were on the verge of collapse, their arms quivering uncontrollably. In the end, the accused managed to outlast his accuser by mere minutes, securing his freedom, but at a terrible physical cost. Now, let's explore one of the most psychologically torturous ordeals, the trial by combat. Imagine being accused of a crime and told that your only recourse is to engage in mortal combat with your accuser or a champion of their choosing. The belief was that God would grant victory to the righteous party. One of the most famous trials by combat took place in 1386 in France. Jacques Le Gris, a Norman knight, was accused of raping the wife of Jean de Carouge. The two men fought before King Charles VI and thousands of spectators. The battle was brutal and lengthy, with both men sustaining serious injuries. In the end, de Carouge emerged victorious, killing Le Gris. But here's the twist. Years later, another man confessed to the crime on his deathbed. Imagine carrying the weight of having killed an innocent man, all because of this barbaric practice. But perhaps one of the most horrifying ordeals was reserved for those accused of witchcraft. Picture this. You're accused of consorting with the devil. You're stripped naked and pricked all over your body with needles. The belief was that witches had spots on their bodies that were insensitive to pain. Any mole, birthmark, or scar could be seen as evidence of guilt. One particularly heartbreaking account comes from the infamous Salem witch trials. An elderly woman named Rebecca Nurse was subjected to this ordeal. Despite her protestations of innocence, a callus on her finger was deemed evidence of her guilt. She was hanged shortly after, her last words a plea to God to forgive her accusers. Now, let's take a moment to consider the long-term psychological effects on those who survived these ordeals. Imagine enduring unimaginable pain and terror, only to be declared innocent. The trauma of such an experience would be life-altering. Many survivors reported recurring nightmares, inability to trust others, and a constant fear of being accused again. One particularly poignant account comes from 13th century England. A man named William, who had survived the ordeal of hot iron, wrote in his journal years later, "Though my hand has long since healed, my soul remains scarred. I see the faces of my accusers in every stranger, and the heat of that iron haunts my dreams." But here's a thought that will truly chill you to the bone. What if these practices never truly went away? What if they just evolved into more socially acceptable forms? Think about it. We may not force people to grasp hot irons anymore, but don't we still subject accused persons to their own forms of ordeal? Consider the intense scrutiny and public shaming that often accompanies modern accusations. The court of public opinion can be just as brutal as any medieval ordeal. Social media has become our modern-day village square, where accusations can spread like wildfire and lives can be ruined in an instant. And what about the psychological torment of lengthy legal proceedings? The stress of waiting for a verdict, knowing that your entire future hangs in the balance. Isn't that its own form of ordeal? As we draw our journey through this dark chapter of human history to a close, I want you to really sit with the weight of what we've explored. The next time you hear about a controversial legal case or witness a public accusation, remember the echoes of these ancient practices that still reverberate through our society. The human desire for simple answers to complex questions, the need to believe in some higher form of justice. These impulses haven't changed much over the centuries. And while we may look back on trial by ordeal with horror, we must always be vigilant against the temptation to seek easy solutions to the messy problem of determining guilt and innocence. So, dear listeners, as you go about your day, spare a thought for those who came before us, for the countless souls who endured unimaginable pain in the name of justice. And perhaps, just perhaps, consider how we might still be subjecting people to their own forms of ordeal in our modern world. The past, as they say, is never truly past. It lives on in our institutions, our beliefs, and our deepest fears. And that, my friends, is truly the most chilling thought of all.